Ukraine has launched its highly anticipated counter-offensive campaign this month, and authorities say advances have been made, but the fighting on the front line remains fierce. So what have been the results of the counter-offensive thus far? Who is winning the war in terms of territory, in terms of military might, and in terms of morale? And are peace efforts looking to bear fruit in the near future? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we address Ukraine's unwavering efforts to defend its country from Russia's invasion that began some 16 months ago. For more on this, I have Professor An Junseong from Yonsei University. Professor An, it's good to have you here.
Hi, thank you.
I also have Professor Robert English at the University of Southern California live on the line. Professor English, it's a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you.
Right, Professor English, perhaps we could start with some details about Ukraine's counter-offensive against Russian invasion. How does its mission appear to be advancing, based on details, of course, shared by the media in recent days?
Well, you know, the answer to that depends on which media you're following. The American media are mainly emphasizing a positive picture for Ukraine, that the fighting is difficult, but that their counteroffensive is making steady progress. European media are a lot more skeptical, and stories about Ukrainian success in retaking territory are balanced by other stories about the very heavy losses in men and equipment that they are suffering. And then you have some countries' media, whether it's China or India, and of course Russia's own media, that describe Ukraine's counteroffensive as essentially a failure, right? In 2 weeks now, they have not achieved any major breakthroughs. And most discouraging is that they are not fighting in this rapid combined arms maneuver kind of warfare that their new Western supplied tanks and armored vehicles were supposed to enable. Instead, they're essentially using the same, artillery barrage and infantry storming attacks that the Russians used. And these come, at very high cost and bring only small gains. So what can we say overall? Ukraine is not losing, but neither is it really winning, not decisively. And unfortunately, it needs to be winning decisively if it wants to count on these continued high levels of Western military and economic aid.
Right, and against that backdrop, Professor English, a rather interesting article by a US media website touched upon the gains of the war based on a few factors as observed by pundits. I would now like to extend that question to you as well, Professor English. Who is winning the war then in terms of territory, in terms of military might, and in terms of morale, in your perspective?
You can only win a war one way, right? That's by defeating the enemy's forces, by battering him badly enough that you can take and hold his territory. You might have more military might, but that doesn't really matter if your tactics are flawed and it backfires. You might have higher morale, but that won't matter if you're still defeated on the battlefield, right? So it really doesn't help to talk about winning in terms of morale if your high morale soldiers are still being killed and wounded in unsustainably large numbers. So I ask you, if what matters above all is taking and holding territory, then who's winning? And unfortunately for Ukraine, so far, it's still Russia that's winning. Now, I should caution that this could change. Some optimists emphasize that even though we're 2 weeks into this counteroffensive, it's still in the early or preparatory stages. They're still probing Russia's defense. They're looking for weak spots where then they intend to counter much heavier forces. Perhaps, and if that's true and it's successful, then things could change dramatically in the coming weeks. But so far, that hasn't occurred. And in the meantime, unfortunately, Ukraine is losing dozens of their new NATO-supplied tanks and armored vehicles that were supposed to play a key role in the big counteroffensive. So if it's going to succeed, we hope to see this kind of breakthrough and change in the tempo of operations very soon.
Right. Professor An, meanwhile, as part of a peace initiative headed by Africa last week, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa led a delegation first to Ukraine and then to Russia. How do you evaluate this latest attempt at peace?
Yes, the peace initiative was, I think, a meaningful attempt, but didn't make any visible progress. And according to the AP News, well, there are two observations. First, that the President Putin, shows some interest in considering the offer made by the African Union. That's a positive side. And second one is that the Russian government stated that they said basically that the African Union had correct understanding of the true cause of the war, which was allegedly created by the West, right? So I guess that put together, I think that Russian side, they are willing to talk if some conditions are met. But if you look at the Ukraine side, that's a different story. But in that regard, we need to keep in mind about the recent declaration made by the President Putin. They say they deploy their tactical nuclear weapons to the Belarus, right? That's really concerning because they use it mean as the deterrence against the Western the forces, right? That's first, right? That's alliance, right? That's very concerning that they're using that the last resort, basically, and also that what's the chance of the peace talk for between the two parties looks very dim because that their precondition to any peace talk is they have sharply different positions. Like for Ukraine side, obviously, they want all Russian troops withdraw from all the occupied territory. That's including all the territories, right? And also Russian side, however, they say they want to, the Ukraine side to acknowledge whatever they had gained this time. Also the one in the Crimea Peninsula, also they want to get everything they wanted. So at this moment, there's very unlikely that they want to have a peace talk because they have two different positions.
Right, and despite that, of course, efforts for peace continue. We have President Yonsei speaking to French daily Le Figaro and claiming that South Korea will go all out for peace in Ukraine. What support do you envision from South Korea?
Well, it's a very interesting question because that you have to look at what happened in reality. Look at the reality of the international politics, and it's kind of also I would think like to ask the Yun administrations how can you define the definition of the national interest? What is the national interest for the South Korea, right? So in terms of national interest for South Korea, it's very delicate. It's not clear and what we should have do on this moment because that basically at the beginning I think the Korean government showed that we'll do kind of a peace, more like a peace measures and peacekeeping purposes, but now they're changing it. They will take everything, whatever it takes. Basically, what they're saying. So, but could it be a political, expression, and they're really specific, what kind of things they do, details. But we have to see, and then before we make any decision, strategic decision, we have to define first what is meaning of the national interest in the Ukraine war from the Korean government perspective, and then we make any careful movement from that. And plus, at this moment, we do not know who's winning clearly and who's losing, although we don't even know how long is the war going on. Right? That's the really top question to answer at this moment, and we have to see how it developed in the future.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor English, as Professor An here in the studio mentioned, Russian leader Vladimir Putin this past Friday, I believe, confirmed that the first tranche of tactical nuclear weapons had been sent to Belarus. What are the implications of this development?
I think there are two things to emphasize here. And the first is that, like before, but even more so, Putin is raising the nuclear threat. He's saber-rattling in hopes of frightening, in hopes of worrying Western governments and Western voters with the goal of weakening their continuing support for arming Ukraine, for continuing and even escalating the conflict. But the second thing to note is that Putin is also indirectly reminding everyone about Russia's opposition to NATO in the first place, that which heightened this confrontation from the beginning. He's essentially saying, oh, you don't like it when we deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of one of our allies? Well, America has been deploying nuclear weapons on the territory of its allies for decades. If you feel threatened, how do you think we feel? Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even Turkey host American nuclear forces. And so, according to the Russians, according to Putin, he's saying there is no way we could stand by and also allow Ukraine to become a NATO base. So this is the other argument he's making indirectly. And although it's virtually ignored in the West, it resonates in countries from India to South Africa. You just can't dismiss it if you are trying to persuade these countries outside the West. You cannot ignore these kinds of complaints that America operates by a double standard. But the more immediate answer to your question, I suppose, is that for the conflict as it's unfolding, it doesn't seem to be working. The nuclear threat has been raised so many times that this incremental, additional saber rattling is falling on mainly deaf ears, and there seems to be confidence in the West that Putin will not use them unless something changes dramatically.
Right, and hopefully the West is correct then. Professor English, NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg says NATO itself is already training Ukrainian pilots on F-16 fighter jets. How does the presence of these jets for Ukraine look to affect perhaps the course of the war?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, again, for Ukraine, these jets will not be ready in time to make any real difference this year. And unfortunately, this is the year that Ukraine needs to win. Right? These pilots now being trained are still months away from being ready. And this is just basic training. This is not for a high level of skill and experience. And equally problematic is that everything that supports these F-16s, right? Specialized equipment, specialized engineers and mechanics, American standard airfields, all of that will take even longer than training the pilots. And the worst thing would be to throw these pilots into battle prematurely and have them suffer heavy losses due to this kind of inadequate preparation, this rushing, and also their encountering of fairly sophisticated Russian anti-aircraft missiles, right? The Russian S-300 anti-aircraft system was essentially designed to combat the F-16 back during the Cold War. They both date back over 20 years. And I can tell you that many American Air Force experts are concerned that this deployment of F-16s could turn into a fiasco that is both militarily damaging and politically humiliating. It has to be done carefully. Unfortunately, it can't be rushed to the extent that it would really impact the counteroffensive underway this spring and summer. It's still months off.
Right, and despite those concerns, Professor An, do you suppose the provision of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine will prompt Russia perhaps to adopt a more aggressive war strategy?
Well, actually, I kind of agree with Professor English on that point, because that they have using the nuclear threat, the last resort already, kind of that it's not really sending stronger message, because that Western, not only like a North Korean situation, right? North Korea always say, oh, you're going to make all the fire on the soil, everything in the full on fire, but we're living in that threat for like decades. So, and any nuclear, threat doesn't really big to us in the daily lives, something like that. So I guess that my concern is that just like what the worst scenario, something happened to Putin personally, or something that's really might be concern, or something dramatic change in the political regime and the Russian side. That's kind of a concerning also. So we'll have to see. But I guess that for them to for the peace talk or the ceasefire, they need some kind of event, something common understanding of both sides to that is time to stop it for any regions. I think that's the time we have to see.
Professor English, while NATO has vowed to tighten ties with Ukraine, it has also made clear that Ukraine will not get a formal invite to join the group when its members gather for a summit in Lithuania next month, I believe. Now, many say this stance itself is no surprise. What are your thoughts?
I agree. Certainly a majority of NATO member countries are supporting Ukraine and want to continue supporting Ukraine, but they also have misgivings about admitting it to the alliance anytime soon. Right? And there are three main reasons for this, I suppose. The first is that it's simply impossible under NATO's own rules to admit a new member state whose borders are contested, who's involved in a conflict. Right? That's the first. The second, of course, is that these member states of NATO worry that it would be enormously provocative to Moscow to accelerate Ukrainian membership, and that it would very quickly draw them, right, the UK, France, Germany, into direct conflict with Russia. And they're very concerned about that. And I suppose the third is a more diffuse long-term concern that Ukraine remains a fairly corrupt, sort of oligarch-dominated society and not established healthy democracy, right? NATO calls itself a club of democracies. And Ukraine, unfortunately, still has a very poor democratic record. This is simply a fact that's been pushed aside by the exigencies of war and admiration for the brave Ukrainian people and their outstanding leader, Zelensky. But it doesn't go away. And again, current NATO members, current EU members understand the difficulty of adapting former communist countries that have been plagued with corruption and anti-democratic tendencies. And so they're very wary of repeating that this time, however much they'd like to help. It just won't happen in the near future.
Meanwhile, back on the actual war itself then, Professor An, simply speaking, as a scholar yourself, do you foresee a prolonged conflict between Ukraine and Russia? And if that is the case, Professor An, what would be the broader consequences of a prolonged conflict on the international community?
Actually, that's very concerning because that, well, since, I see that the Ukraine situation as, kind of a reflection about Korean War, 1950s and 53. What happened was that those two superpowers came together. That the ceasefire until take to about 3 years. And what happened at the end, they just make the line, right? Draw the line. And they say, oh, this is over, right? And that's my concerning because that at the end, that if there's something really not much a break of balance between two powers, they might have a compromise it, two superpower, obviously one Russia and US come together and then let's, divide half, something like that. That's really concerning. Also, that's the worst situation, even the worst situation is that like a Vietnam War, what US really, had a struggle in the battle there. So that about how it happens. So you have to, I guess it's more, time is kind of against the Western, because you need to take something more effective, and then about even the Ukraine the attack counterattack also is time sensitive and time is essential because they have to show progress so that other Western ally will trust them and support them more effectively. But if it's not making much progress, that will be very concerning, and then the international community also will be concerned about the prolonged the war. That's really the worst situation.
Right, and staying with that, Professor English, do you believe a prolonged warfare will challenge the US's as well as, of course, NATO's support for Ukraine against Russian invasion?
Yes, and in fact, it's already happening. And in some ways, this is a central part of the attrition war strategy that Putin turned to when the initial Russian blitzkrieg failed. Right? Moscow saw that the US essentially gave up on Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Moscow saw how public opinion in the West turned against these long and inconclusive wars. Moscow sees right now that Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Kevin McCarthy, and other leading Republican Party members already want to cut support for Ukraine. And Moscow is also watching the weakening support for war in many West European countries. And they know that it will get even more difficult as the EU's economic problems continue to grow. Right? The European Union has now officially entered a period of recession. So these pressures will grow. And Western leaders all know this. They're all afraid of it. And while they put on a brave face of supporting Ukraine to the end in public, they are privately very worried that time is running out. That's why, again, I emphasize that Ukraine's current counteroffensive this summer and into the fall is so important. Because if Ukraine cannot achieve some big gains and reclaim a lot of territory, then the billions in military and economic aid may start drying up. And privately, many European politicians are already saying, if Ukraine cannot turn this aid into victory, then why are we doing it? Right? Why are we supporting continued war instead of a negotiated peace? Right? These leaders are privately saying, look, I have to face re-election, and my challenger is destroying me on these kinds of economic issues. The voters are facing sky-high inflation, and again, now this recession. And so the pressure on me for re-election is growing intense. There have to be some results of all these billions in aid, or else a shift in Western strategy. Unfortunately, in other words, the attrition strategy, Professor An is absolutely correct. Western states have enormous strengths, right, in technology and organization, in their sophistication of their militaries. But Western states also have the weakness of public opinion and impatience. And unfortunately, in a time of growing economic difficulty, that patience will begin running out, and the pressure on leaders to find a new strategy to somehow bring this war to an end will continue steadily to grow.
And given that potential reality as painted by Professor English, Professor An, what endgame do you envision with regard to the ongoing war in Ukraine? I mean, do you see a ceasefire similar to the one that we have here on the Korean Peninsula? Do you see an eventual peace deal, or maybe a victory by one of the two countries, or even a nuclear confrontation?
Yeah, well, I guess that I try to avoid the last, the worst situation, the nuclear confrontation. But other than that, I guess that there's really the all options open right now. And like in terms of a game theory, I was interesting. So we have a peace war game. One of the game theory is interesting about that how can you keep international peace? We can sometimes some scholars apply the game theory in that situation, but in order to get a peace, international peace under the game theory, that there are two conditions should be met. First one is that both sides doesn't know how many times they play the game, so doesn't know when they finish. And second is that both sides knows that the other side can revenge when the other side, one side is betrayed. So you can be revenged, and also they don't know how many times they play the game. So what happened was that, well, in the Ukraine situation, I guess it's already happening in terms of the peace war game, because they both sides know how long it's going to go, the war is going to continue. And second is that they know, both sides know they can revenge the other side. This is what happening, counteroffensive right at this moment, right? So I guess that's things what happening. So I guess that we need some time. I think Professor English comment about the interesting about the summer, the bottom line, or fall perhaps, that winter comes. I think the European country like Germany had a trauma going against Russia historically, right? So the war in Russia in winter time, that's really the nightmare for the Western countries. So I guess that things that in that perspective, I guess Russia, Ukraine side have to show really significant progress at their front. I think that's the things they do for about 3 or 4 months.
Right. And Professor English, very briefly speaking, what endgame do you envision?
I think I agree with Professor An. Ultimately, it could be a Korea-like scenario of a ceasefire, but no agreed peace, no internationally, managed settlement. I suppose there's a good chance still, 25, 30%, who can be precise, that Ukraine will succeed in a major counteroffensive operation that, as many say, we are only seeing the beginning phases of that counteroffensive, the probing, testing phase, and the big thrust will come soon. So maybe 25, 30% chance that will occur. And if so, that would push Russia back significantly. A retreat may be leaving Russia only in possession of Crimea, a very strong bargaining position for Ukraine with full NATO support, let's say, come November. Unfortunately, I think the chances are greater, 65, 70%, that Ukraine's gains will be much smaller and will come at a huge cost in men and equipment, and that NATO support, will again start to dwindle and leave Ukraine no choice but to accept a ceasefire that essentially freezes the lines of control, the division of territory, roughly where they are now, maybe with, several hundred square kilometers more, but no big change. Professor An is right about that. And, I might add, since he brought in, the academic perspective of game theory here, we also have the academic the framework of analysis called the two-level game that looks at international conflict, international confrontation, not only on the international side, the battlefield between the two countries, but sees a simultaneous battle at home, right, for public support. And in this case, it's notable that both Vladimir Putin has promised victory, and Zelensky has promised not to give up one bit of territory. So each one is trapped by these maximalist promises. Each one could suffer defeat politically at home if they settle for much less.
Right.
And that's a real settlement's difficult. A Korean outcome is the most likely.
Right. Which is why we probably, I suppose time will tell then. Time will tell us what will happen in the future then. Professor English, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor An here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Wednesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching.